Every year, people from countries where roads are smooth, salaries are higher, and government addresses can be found in seconds come to Costa Rica and start thinking about moving. They find here the ocean, green mountains, volcanoes, a warm climate, and a strange feeling that life doesn't have to be in a constant rush. But Costa Rica attracts not only with its nature. In 1948, it disbanded its standing army and enshrined this choice in its constitution. While its neighbors experienced coups, civil wars, and military regimes, this small country tried to build security through institutions, education, and healthcare. Here, many houses don't have usual street numbers. An address might start from an old tree, a church, or a football field. Here, two oceans are within a single day's reach, and a tropical downpour can begin in the middle of a sunny morning. Here, a sloth can hold up traffic, a monkey can steal food, and crocodiles lie under a bridge that cars drive across every day. But this isn't a promotional video about paradise. Behind the green forests lie expensive groceries, difficult roads, traffic jams, inequality, seasonal work, and the problem of drug trafficking. A country without an army didn't become a country without threats. It simply decided to respond to them differently. Today, we will examine real life in Costa Rica, why Americans and Europeans move here, how the Pura Vida philosophy works, what happened in December 1948, why the forest became an economic asset, how people live on the Nicoya Peninsula, and why some residents still dream of leaving. And at the end, we will answer the main question. Has Costa Rica truly found the recipe for a happy life? Or has it just learned better than others to show what a good compromise looks like? If you enjoy documentary travelogues about countries without gloss and ready-made cliches, subscribe to the channel. And now, let's start not on the beach, but with a map that explains almost everything. Costa Rica is located between Nicaragua and Panama, between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. On the map, it looks like a small strip of land, but the distance between its coasts is filled with different climates and landscapes. On one coast, you can see humid Caribbean forests and fishing villages. On the other, wide Pacific beaches, dry savannas, and places where the tourist season is structured completely differently. In the center of the country, mountains and volcanic ranges rise. They divide climate zones, create cool valleys, and collect moisture that later feeds the rivers. A volcano in Costa Rica is not necessarily a symbol of danger. For locals, it can be a source of fertile soil, hot springs, tourism, and electricity. Here, the land simultaneously feeds, frightens, and earns a living. According to the World Bank, Costa Rica's population is about 5 million people. But more important than the number itself is how it is distributed. Most economic activity is concentrated around the Central Valley, where San Jose, Alajuela, Heredia, and Cartago are located. There, roads are denser, and there are more universities, hospitals, offices, and housing. Leave this corridor, and the country quickly becomes much less urban. And it is here that the traveler encounters the first mystery. Imagine you need to call a taxi, order a delivery, or explain to a doctor where you live. You open the address, and instead of a house number, you see a description. 200 meters south of the church, then 75 meters east of the old school. The house with the green gate. This is not a joke or stylization for tourists. This is genuinely how everyday navigation can work. The reason grew out of the very structure of cities and towns. For a long time, it was easier for people to navigate by a church, market, tree, shop, or football field than by a unified street grid. Directions here are sometimes measured not by cardinal points in a strict geographical sense, but by habitual movement relative to the center. A person doesn't read an address as a code. They mentally trace a route. The most surprising thing begins when the landmark disappears. The shop closed, the tree was cut down, the cinema was demolished, but the address continues to live on in conversations for many more years. A new courier needs to know not just the map, but also the memory of the neighborhood. For locals, this is natural. The old place remains a point of collective geography, even if it physically no longer exists. Today, digital maps, apps, and government addressing are gradually changing the system. In cities, you can send a geolocation, put a pin at the gate, or name an official street. But oral landmarks haven't disappeared. They outlived the technology because they carry something that an impersonal number lacks: the story of what the neighborhood used to be like. In this detail, all of Costa Rica is already visible. A modern state can export medical technology and produce clean electricity, while the road to an ordinary house still goes past a tree that has long been gone. For a tourist, this is a fun fact. For a resident, it's a working system. And for someone who has just moved, it's the first serious test of the promised paradise. San Jose often disappoints tourists. This is not an ideal colonial capital with wide squares and flawless facades. There are traffic jams, noise, neighborhoods where you need to be careful, complex urban development, and constant movement. But if you look not through the lens of resort advertising, the capital shows the real Costa Rica better than an empty beach. San Jose's Central Market lives with the smells of fruit, coffee, meat, herbs, and home-cooked food. Here you can see how the city preserves its rural foundation. Products arrive from mountain regions, vendors know their regular customers, and conversation is sometimes more important than speed of service. In a small cafe, a plate of rice, beans, meat, salad, and plantain can tell you more about the country than an expensive restaurant with an ocean view. Morning often starts with Gallo pinto, a mix of rice and beans served with egg, cheese, plantain, or a tortilla. By midday, casado appears: rice, beans, salad, vegetables, and meat or fish on one plate. The names may sound unfamiliar, but the logic of the food itself is extremely practical. This is not a gastronomic spectacle, but a filling set meal for someone who needs to work until evening. On the Caribbean coast, the same country sounds and smells different. In Limon province, the Afro-Caribbean heritage is more noticeable. English Creole intonations, music, coconut milk, seafood, and spices. Rice and beans here can be prepared completely differently than in the Central Valley. The same basic set of ingredients tells two different stories of migration and the coast. Pacific resort towns live at yet another rhythm. There, the menu adapts more quickly to surfers, foreigners, and seasonal flows. Next to a family soda, the name for small local eateries, coffee shops, health food restaurants, and places with prices not meant for local salaries appear. Food immediately shows where the everyday country ends and the experience economy begins. Coffee here is also not just a drink after breakfast. It is connected to how the country built roads, accumulated capital, and integrated into world trade. Behind the habit of taking a pause with a cup lies an entire economic history. Later, we will also see its dark side. The farmer receives nowhere near the price that the tourist sees in a trendy coffee shop. But for now, it is important to notice something else. Costa Rican culture is not reduced to one beach and one plate. The Caribbean coast, the Central Valley, the Northern Plains, and dry Guanacaste differ in music, climate, accents, food, and the pace of the day. The country's small size creates an illusion of uniformity that an ordinary trip through the mountains quickly shatters. An hour's drive from the capital, a different Costa Rica begins. In small towns, the rhythm remains tied to the church, the square, the school, the farm, and the soccer field. Here, neighbors more often know each other, and the daily schedule depends not only on the phone, but also on the rain, the harvest, the road, and family matters. One of the recognizable details of rural culture is the painted ox cart. In the past, they helped transport coffee across the mountains to the coast. Today, their bright patterns have become a symbol of craftsmanship and festivals. UNESCO, in its dossier on the tradition of ox carts in Costa Rica, notes that these carts are linked to the history of rural labor, artistic painting, and the family transmission of skills. On one side of the country, clinics and technology companies operate. On the other, artisans still paint cart parts by hand. These are not two different Costa Ricas, but two speeds of one country. It can produce medical equipment for the global market and simultaneously preserve a craft that grew out of transporting coffee along dirt roads. But if the country has one international password, it is Pura Vida. Literally, the phrase can be translated as pure life. But in conversation, it means much more. It is a greeting, a thank you, an answer to the question, "How are you?" a wish for a good day, and sometimes a way of saying, "Not everything went perfectly, but we carry on." A tourist hears Pura Vida within the first hours. A local uses it as a familiar intonation, not as a marketing slogan. This philosophy has a pleasant side. People are less likely to turn every delay into a disaster, more often start a conversation with a personal connection, and do not always consider rushing proof of importance. But there is also a downside. If you are used to a meeting at 2, meaning 2 minutes to 2, the local attitude toward time can drive you to irritation. The bus is delayed, repairs are postponed, the courier explains they will be there soon, and soon turns out to be an elastic concept. Costa Ricans sometimes call this hora tica, tico time. It does not mean everyone is always late or that there is no discipline in the country. Rather, society is more tolerant of the fact that life does not always obey a schedule. In emergency medicine and at the airport, minutes matter. At a family meal or in a conversation with a neighbor, a completely different scale applies. Visitors often go through 3 stages. First, they get indignant, then they start padding the time in advance. And sometimes they notice that they themselves have stopped checking the clock every 5 minutes. I would not declare Pura Vida a universal remedy for stress. Slow living can be pleasant when a person has money, health, and choice. For someone waiting for a bus in the heat or losing a workday due to a delay, it feels different. And this is where an important thought emerges. A country's well-being cannot be measured by a single smile. You need institutions that work even when no one says Pura Vida. On December 1st, 1948, a symbolic episode occurred in San Jose, which still defines the perception of Costa Rica. After a civil conflict, the leader of the victorious side, José Figueres Ferrer, announced the dissolution of the army. A year later, the ban on a standing army was enshrined in the Constitution, and Article 12 remains in effect today. Instead of keeping the Bella Vista Barracks as a military center, it was turned into the National Museum. In the place where weapons and soldiers once stood, exhibitions on history, culture, and nature appeared. This is one of those political gestures that look impressive in a photograph, but what matters more is what happened afterward. The Costa Rican Constitution directly prohibits a standing army as an institution. Yet the country did not become completely defenseless. It has police, a coast guard, and mechanisms for international security. The dissolution of the army did not abolish crime, smuggling, or the need to protect borders. It changed where the state directs resources and what role the armed forces play in politics. It is important not to turn this decision into a fairy tale where a single act of abolishing the army automatically created happiness. Costa Rica remained a small country with a particular political history, geography, and neighbors. Its success was influenced by education, civic institutions, trade unions, healthcare, relative stability, and favorable economic periods. But the symbol has practical significance. When the army is not the main political player, generals do not have the same opportunity to seize power. The military budget does not disappear without a trace, and the freed-up funds can be directed to other systems. According to World Bank data in a review of Costa Rica, the country spent decades developing human capital, social programs, and environmental policy precisely within the framework of more stable civil institutions. I believe the main lesson here is not that all countries should immediately disband their armies. Such a conclusion would be irresponsible. States have different histories, different threats, and different borders. Costa Rica's lesson lies elsewhere. Security can be not only the quantity of weapons, but also the quality of schools, courts, medicine, trust, and political rules. There is another test of this idea, one rarely mentioned in beautiful videos. Costa Rica is located in a zone of earthquakes, eruptions, landslides, floods, and tropical storms. Here, a threat can come not across the border, but from underground or from the ocean. At such a moment, the country needs rescuers, police, firefighters, medical services, communications, and a functioning evacuation system. The absence of a standing army does not cancel the mobilization of society. It forces a prior understanding of who will open shelters, repair the road, deliver water, and search for people after a landslide. A school becomes a relief center, a municipality becomes a headquarters, and a neighbor with an SUV is sometimes more useful than armored vehicles. This is a less spectacular security because its main result is a catastrophe that did not become even worse. But even here, there is no perfect picture. Poor areas usually suffer more from floods and landslides, remote villages wait longer for help, and rapid construction creates new vulnerabilities. Institutions are important not because they eliminate disasters, but because they determine who receives a warning, assistance, and the chance to return home. But the army is only half the story. The second half begins in the forest. At one time, a significant portion of Costa Rica was covered in forests. Then cities grew, pastures expanded, plantations and timber exports increased. Like many tropical countries, Costa Rica lost large areas of forest cover. The economy demanded land, and preserving trees was long perceived as foregoing income. The turnabout occurred not only because of laws on protected areas. The state began paying landowners for environmental services, forest conservation, watershed restoration, biodiversity protection, and carbon sequestration. The official FONA-FIFO program demonstrates the logic of this decision. The forest ceased to be useless land that could be sold for pasture and became an asset that generates income precisely because it remains alive. The idea sounds simple. If society obtains clean water, soil protection, climate benefits, and tourism revenue thanks to the forest, the landowner should not be the only one bearing the cost of its preservation. Protecting nature is easier when a person has an economic reason not to cut it down. Thus, the forest gradually returned to a significant portion of the territory. But here it is important to avoid the loud myth of a miracle that happened on its own. Recovery depends on land ownership, control, the quality of statistics, natural reforestation, and exactly what kind of forest emerges. A tree plantation and a complex tropical ecosystem are not the same thing. Costa Rica also created a network of national parks and protected areas. According to the National System of Conservation Areas, SINAC, land protection became one of the central tools of environmental policy. For a tourist, this means suspension bridges, trails, volcanoes, and rare animals. For the local state, it means expenses for rangers, infrastructure, control, and relationships with the communities around the parks. Ecology here long ago ceased to be just a moral idea. It became part of the economy. The tourist pays for park entry, accommodation, the guide's work, transportation, and food. The farmer receives payment for preserving a plot of land. The country sells coffee with a more eco-friendly image, hosts researchers, and builds an international reputation around nature. But ecotourism can also put pressure on a place. If too many people come to see one volcano, a sloth, or a beach with turtles, nature turns into a queue. Hotels consume water, roads expand, housing prices rise. The paradise sold through preserved forest can lose some of its tranquility because of its own visitors. The same logic applies to energy. According to the Costa Rican Institute of Electricity, Instituto Costarricense de Electricidad, Costa Rica's power system gets the majority of its generation from renewable sources: hydropower, geothermal, wind, and solar. In some years, the share of nearly fully renewable generation becomes a reason for global headlines. But the word nearly is important here. Electricity and the country's entire energy sector are not the same thing. Cars, trucks, aviation, and industrial fuel can depend on oil even when electrical outlets are powered by a river, a volcano, or the wind. Therefore, Costa Rica achieved an impressive result, but did not become completely independent from fossil fuels. I like that there is room for precision in this story. A country can be one of the world leaders in clean electricity and simultaneously face traffic jams and gasoline-powered cars. Good policy does not have to turn a state into a perfect postcard. It should solve one problem at a time. And now, let's meet those for whom many people come to Costa Rica. But we warn you, some local residents will act as if they are the ones who own the country. The sloth became a symbol of Costa Rica because it combines two things: incredible biology and a complete lack of haste. It moves slowly, spends a lot of time in trees, and can look as if it is interested neither in the tourist, nor the camera, nor the tour schedule. On the road, the sloth does not understand that cars have a schedule. That is why near some sections, special crossings are built, and volunteers help animals cross dangerous roads. This does not mean that every sloth gets a personal bridge. But the idea of infrastructure that takes animals into account shows a change in attitude toward nature. The forest ceases to be a backdrop for humans and becomes a space that must be shared. In the national parks, you can encounter monkeys, toucans, iguanas, raccoons, and many species of hummingbirds. Sometimes wild animals approach tourists because they know that food and attention might be nearby. This is precisely where environmental culture clashes with the bad habit of feeding animals for the sake of a photograph. Capuchins on the beaches of Manuel Antonio are known for being able to snatch a bag or food. A raccoon can open a zipper. A bird remembers where people leave fruit. For the tourist, this is a funny episode. For the animal, it is reinforced behavior that can make it dependent on human trash. Under the bridge over the Tarcoles River, you can see a large concentration of American crocodiles. They lie on sandbars while cars drive overhead. The place has become a tourist stop, but the crocodiles are not an attraction and do not follow a script. You cannot approach the water, throw food, or assume that a railing replaces caution. Humpback whales appear on the coast, with migration periods from different hemispheres potentially stretching the observation season. Sea turtles come onto the sand to lay their eggs. In some places, tourist flow helps fund protection, while in others, it disrupts lighting, scares animals with noise, and increases pressure on the beach. This is how Costa Rica teaches, from childhood, a simple thing. The world does not belong to humans alone. This is not always a convenient philosophy. It means you cannot build a road without considering migration, photograph any animal with a flash, or leave a bag on the beach because someone else will pick it up in the morning. But if the forest and the ocean explain how the country relates to nature, the Nicoya Peninsula shows how it relates to time. Nicoya is located on the northwest Pacific coast. It is often called one of the blue zones, regions where a noticeable proportion of people live to a very old age. The very concept of blue zones is linked to longevity research and was popularized by the National Geographic Project and Dan Buettner. It is important not to turn Nicoya into a magical peninsula where every resident is guaranteed to live to be 100 years old. The data depend on the quality of registration, generations, access to medicine, social composition, and the research method. The CRELES research project of the University of Costa Rica studies population aging and longevity, and its materials show that life expectancy is influenced by a whole set of conditions, not just a single superfood. Traditional Nicoyan food includes corn, beans, rice, fruits, vegetables, and products from local farms. Corn is treated with lime, which helps alter its properties and increase the availability of certain nutrients. Water in some areas is rich in minerals. People move a lot, not in the gym, but in the garden, on the farm, on the road, and around the house. But food is only part of the story. Researchers use the concept of plan de vida, a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. An elderly person is not just an object of care. They can be needed by their family, help with household chores, tell stories, look after grandchildren, and maintain a sense of responsibility. This does not mean there is no loneliness, poverty, or illness in Nicoya. It is simply that the social structure keeps older people within the family and community for longer. Where an elderly person daily sees acquaintances, moves around, works within their abilities, and has a role, aging looks different. The healthcare system of Costa Rica is also important. The Pan American Health Organization, in its materials about the country, describes the development of universal medical institutions and the role of primary care. Rural clinics and medical teams do not make all problems disappear, but they allow a person to receive care closer to home, not only in the capital. This is why the question, "What do long-lived people eat?" is too narrow. The Nicoya recipe is made up of food, water, movement, family, climate, the habit of living without haste, and the feeling that you are needed. It is precisely this combination that cannot be bought in a supermarket along with a can of promised longevity. Costa Rica is not a country without religion. Sunday in a small town can be associated with church, a family table, and a soccer match. The Catholic tradition has historically left its mark on festivals, architecture, and the calendar. But society is becoming more diverse. Evangelical communities, people of other faiths, and those who relate to religion more culturally than personally live nearby. Soccer fulfills part of the same social function as the town square or church. It creates a common topic for neighbors, families, and generations. In a country with different coasts, migrant communities, and urban differences, the national team helps people feel a sense of shared belonging for a time. This is a simple but important detail. State stability does not mean people discuss the Constitution every day. Most trust is built on recurring encounters. The vendor knows the customer, the neighbor sees the neighbor, the family gathers on the weekend, the child goes to the soccer field. Politics sets the framework, but the country feels itself through small rituals. Now let's talk about those who come to Costa Rica not for 2 weeks, but for years. Americans, Canadians, and Europeans move here for various reasons. Some retire and want to live in the warmth. Some work remotely. Some sell their homes in an expensive city and are looking for a calmer pace. Others are attracted by the medicine, nature, the Spanish language, expatriate communities, and the feeling that there is still room for air in life. But the word expat sometimes sounds too pleasant. Moving changes the housing market, prices, and relationships with local residents. A neighborhood that was affordable for a Costa Rican family can become expensive after the arrival of short-term rentals, restaurants, and foreign demand. For the newcomer, it is a comfortable new home. For the local, it is a question of whether they can stay in their own town. There are also migrants of another type, people who come not with savings and a remote salary, but fleeing crisis, poverty, or violence in neighboring countries. The International Organization for Migration, IOM, in its materials on Costa Rica, shows that the country remains an important destination and transit point in Central America. Flows of people create a strain on housing, schools, medicine, borders, and the labor market. One cannot place a wealthy retiree from the USA on the same level as a person who crosses the border without money or documents. They have different opportunities, risks, and attitudes toward the country, but both flows change Costa Rica. One raises real estate prices and creates new services, the other requires humanitarian and state support. Moving to Costa Rica is often sold as a simple change of scenery. In practice, you need to handle paperwork, figure out taxes, insurance, the language, banking regulations, and healthcare. Humidity, insects, torrential rains, traffic jams, and slow repairs also become part of the new life. Paradise begins not with a view of the palm trees, but with whether you can solve an ordinary problem without the familiar system. And here we come to the price. Costa Rica is not always a cheap country for a foreigner. Imported products, electronics, cars, rent in popular areas, and services for tourists can cost more than a person from the US or Europe expects. The local salary and prices for someone arriving with foreign income are not the same thing. This is felt especially strongly not on vacation, but in the third month of living there. A tourist compares the cost of a hotel. A resident counts rent, electricity, internet, insurance, school, car repairs, and every trip to buy groceries. The air conditioner in humid heat, the dehumidifier in the house, and fuel for the daily commute quickly turn a beautiful climate into a line item in the budget. Local products can be affordable if you buy them at the market and cook at home. But familiar imported cheese, electronics, car parts, or cosmetics sometimes cost unexpectedly high. A person arrives with an idea of cheap Central America and then discovers the price of a small market, taxes, logistics, and tourist demand. Housing also cannot be judged by a single average figure. In San Jose, on the Pacific coast, in a mountain town, and in a remote village, these are 4 different markets. A house by the ocean may look affordable compared to California, but completely unaffordable for a family on a local salary. And a cheap house far from the center may require a car, repairs, protection from humidity, and hours of daily commuting. Foreign income can make such a life comfortable, but it also creates an optical illusion. The newcomer says the country is inexpensive because they compare it to their previous income, while the neighbor sees how rent is rising faster than their salary. Both are telling the truth. They just live in different economies on the same street. Roads in mountainous areas can be slow and uneven. The distance on the map looks small, but a downpour, construction, a truck, or a winding road turns 2 hours into 5. The railway system is limited, public transport depends on the region, and a car becomes almost necessary outside the central cities. Costa Rica is also not a completely safe island. The country has ordinary crime, theft, problems with firearms, and the growing influence of international drug trafficking. According to UNODC data in materials on drug markets in Central America, the region lies on an important transit route between producing countries and consumers in the north. Geography brings tourism and at the same time creates vulnerability for smuggling. The abolition of the army did not stop criminals. The police cannot replace all the functions of the army in every scenario, and the Coast Guard does not turn long maritime borders into a hermetic wall. So the question, how do they live without an army, needs to be asked more precisely. Costa Rica lives without a standing army, but not without law enforcement institutions, international cooperation, and security problems. In tourist areas, caution is needed just as in any popular place. Don't leave your phone on the beach, don't walk at night on unfamiliar streets, don't flaunt money, and check your transport. Nature does not cancel out urban risks, and portraying the country as absolute paradise can make a tourist less attentive. Therein lies the main ethical conflict of a tourist video. The more beautifully we show Costa Rica, the more we risk hiding the people for whom it is not a vacation. The hotel worker does not live in an endless pool. The farmer depends on the price of... Now let's return to coffee, because it connects almost all layers of the country. Coffee became one of the engines of the Costa Rican economy and shaped rural communities, transport routes, and trade ties. The highland climate and volcanic soils are suitable for growing high-quality Arabica. But a cup of coffee in an expensive cafe does not show how much labor lies between the plantation and the export container. A small farmer faces climate change, plant diseases, the cost of fertilizers, fluctuations in global prices, and the need to compete with large producers. Tourism helps sell the story of origin. The visitor sees the plantation, the mill, the drying process, and the cup. However, the added value is distributed unevenly. Pineapples have become another important export commodity, but their production raises questions about land use, chemicals, water, and labor conditions. Costa Rica can be green in advertising and at the same time have industries that put pressure on nature. Two things can be true at once. It seems to me this is one of the most interesting aspects of the country. It did not save nature once and for all. It constantly negotiates with its own contradictions. The forest needs to be preserved, but people need work. Tourism brings money, but overloads beaches. Exports support the economy, but require land and water. A good environmental reputation does not exempt one from finding new solutions. Costa Rica also attracts attention because its nature seems too dense for a small country. On a narrow strip of land, you find rainforest, volcanoes, dry forest, mangroves, coral coasts, and mountain ecosystems. According to estimates from international conservation organizations, the country holds an unusually large share of the world's biodiversity relative to its area. But biodiversity is not a collection of pretty animals. It depends on corridors between forests, clean rivers, the absence of poaching, sustainable agriculture, and tourist behavior. If a forest plot becomes an isolated island, animals find it harder to move, find food, and reproduce. That is why a sloth bridge or a turtle beach protection is not a cute bonus, but part of the infrastructure. At some point, the country must decide whether it wants to see nature only on logos or is willing to redesign roads, lighting, tourism, and construction so that animals still have space. The shift from an army to forests and from forests to medicine may seem abrupt. But in Costa Rica, all these themes are connected by one idea. The state invests in things that do not provide an instant photo opportunity. A school does not go viral. Primary healthcare rarely makes the cover. A forest that was not cut down does not look like news. A law that prevented a general from coming to power cannot be captured in a close-up. But it is precisely such invisible decisions that shape a country more powerfully than any single beach. This explains why Costa Rica sometimes appears richer than its statistics and poorer than its advertising. It has strong institutions and infrastructure problems. It has a high international image and uneven access to its benefits. It has green energy and a dependence on fuel. It has peace and criminal risks. A practical trip here needs to be planned by region. If you want volcanoes and cool air, choose the Central Valley and areas around Arenal. If you are interested in forests and animals, you need to look at national parks and the rules of the specific reserve. The Caribbean coast lives at its own pace with different cuisine, music, and humidity. The Pacific regions differ in beaches, surfing, dry season, and varying prices. The dry season is usually more convenient for roads and beaches, but this does not mean no rain everywhere. The wet season makes the forest especially green, reduces tourist flow, and simultaneously complicates travel. The road to a beautiful place can become difficult after a downpour. Before a trip, you need to check the weather, road conditions, park schedules, and entry requirements. In Costa Rica, you cannot plan too tight an itinerary. On a map, a place seems close, but mountain roads and truck traffic change the travel time. It is better to leave a buffer, especially if you need to catch a flight or cross several climate zones in one day. And do not perceive local slowness as free entertainment. For a tourist, a delay is part of the atmosphere. For a person waiting for a paycheck or medical care, it can be a serious problem. Respect for Pura Vida does not negate the right to efficient services. Now let's return to why people stay. Some choose Costa Rica for the climate, others for education, healthcare, or political stability. Still others want to live closer to nature. Some leave behind the constant fear they knew from past experience. But almost no one gets an ideal life here without compromises. Instead of an army, the country chose police and institutions, but crime has not disappeared. Instead of mass deforestation, it chose payment for environmental services, but the economy still depends on exports and tourism. Instead of a race at any cost, it promotes Pura Vida, but traffic jams and prices can make a person rush. Instead of perfect healthcare, it created a broad system, but queues and unequal access remain. Costa Rica does not answer the question how to live right. It shows that some solutions only work as a package. You cannot take one beautiful part and transplant it without context. Abolishing the army requires institutions. Forest restoration requires money for landowners. Longevity requires family, movement, and medicine. Peace requires trust and the ability to resolve conflicts. A country without an army is not a country without conflicts. A country with vast forests is not a country without environmental problems. A country where they say Pura Vida is not a country without stress. But it is precisely the ability not to match the advertising image that makes it interesting. There are countries that promise happiness through consumption. There are countries that promise safety through weapons. There are countries that try to buy the future with oil or concrete. Costa Rica has for decades invested in less visible things: education, medicine, forests, stability, and the habit of negotiation. Sometimes these investments yield a beautiful result: a green forest, a clean river, a centenarian on the porch, and a child who knows the names of birds. Sometimes the result is not beautiful at all: a long line, a slow road, an expensive product, or a difficult conversation about drug trafficking. But all of this is one country. So what does Pura Vida actually mean? Not that life is always clean and easy. Rather, it is an acknowledgement that life has already begun, and therefore it must not only be accelerated and controlled, You can live among volcanoes, rains, traffic jams, expensive stores, and dangerous routes, and still maintain the feeling that the day is not reduced to a problem. Costa Rica did not abandon reality for paradise. It built an order in which paradise became part of the economy and culture, and then discovered that any paradise requires constant work. Behind the sloth is a protected road. Behind clean energy, a complex network. Behind the forest, payments and oversight. Behind longevity, family, a clinic and daily physical life. Behind the absence of an army, institutions that cannot be allowed to weaken. That is precisely why people keep coming here. Not because there are no problems here, but because many problems did not become the country's only language. In the morning, you can hear monkeys. In the afternoon, hold a meeting at a tech company. In the evening, watch the sunset over the ocean. And the next day, discuss rising prices and security. The contradiction does not disappear. It simply lives alongside beauty. Costa Rica is not a place where people conquered time, fear, and poverty. It is a place where society tried to choose what to pay attention to. Not the army, but a school. Not deforestation, but the forest. Not maximum speed, but human relationships. Not an ideal image, but the opportunity to start anew each day. If this episode helped you see Costa Rica as more complex than just a country of beaches and palm trees, hit like and write in the comments what surprised you the most: the absence of a standing army, addresses from trees, Pura Vida, the forests, Nicoya, or the cost of living in paradise. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. In the next journey, we will again set off to a country where behind the most beautiful facade lies a history of decisions, compromises, and people who continue to live inside it every day.